One of the strangest things about the ABC is its persecution complex. This is a national, publicly funding broadcasting behemoth funded by taxpayers to the tune of $1,200 million a year, where 4,000 people spread right across the country spend much of their time pumping each other's tyres and running their own ideological crusades. Yet they bristle at criticism. The latest example has been when their leading political reporter and staff-elected board member, no less, told a group of fellow travellers that Australia is a racist country and that the opposition leader Peter Dutton was deliberately inflaming racism. Now, never mind that Laura Tingle was out of line, never mind that her critics were vindicated because the ABC itself was forced to admit that she'd broken their guidelines for objective journalism, and never mind that this massive taxpayer entity needs to be accountable to the people who pay for it and who are supposed to be served by it. Never mind any of that, the ABC's managing director says there was a News Corp pile-on against Tingle.
I think that there are a lot of News Corp reactions, a lot of News Corp attention that the ABC gets regularly every week.
News Corp are obsessed with the ABC, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
This is pretty amusing stuff, isn't it? Especially when you consider how obsessed the ABC seems to be with News Corp. In fact, I think some of us here at News Corp, including me, should be paid by the ABC because they regularly use our material like clockwork, really, on Monday nights on Media Watch, where the classic old ABC lefty Paul Barry targets News Corp as he pushes his own green left views on climate change, on US politics and on the Middle East. And he was at it again last night.
Following an Israeli strike on a displaced persons camp in Rafah, which the Gaza Health Ministry says killed at least 45 people who had been told it was safe to shelter there.
That's Paul Barry and the ABC parroting information supplied by the Gaza Health Ministry. In other words, Hamas. They treat what Hamas says as fact. They accept it without question. Tragically, there's little doubt some civilians were killed in this bombing attack, which was directed at Hamas terrorists. We still don't know how many terrorists were killed, but we do know it was not at a displaced persons camp. The site was hundreds of metres from the refugee camp, so it was not an Israeli strike at a displaced persons camp, as Barry couches it, but an Israeli strike on Hamas terrorists that may have led to civilian casualties. Israel is investigating, but there have been independently verified claims that Hamas munitions probably exploded in the attack, spreading fire and creating much of the carnage. Now, if we go back to last October, when Barry first covered the unfolding war triggered by the Hamas atrocity that slaughtered more than 1,200 Israeli civilians, well, even back then, Barry was much more sceptical about Israel's claims than he is now about Hamas propaganda.
Et il va être extrêmement difficile pour moi de vous décrire l'horreur, l'apocalypse.
Babies, their heads cut off. That's what they said. Gunned down, families completely gunned down in their beds.
That horrific baby claim went viral on social media, with 44 million views on X in just 24 hours. And it made headlines in Australia.
Monsters cut heads off babies.
But was it true? Palestinian supporters on social media swore it was cruel propaganda and baseless lies used to justify all-out war.
So that's lesson number one for Paul Barry. Skepticism is terrific. All journalists should be sceptical about everything. But Barry is sceptical of Israel, a liberal democracy that operates under the rule of law with a robust and open political system, accountability and a free press, while at the same time he accepts as fact the information we get from the Islamist extremist terrorism outfit of Hamas. That is a perverse take on truth and scepticism from Paul Barry. Let's hear some more from him.
And while Kenny did mention the Rafah strike in passing, he mocked the claim that mostly civilians had been killed and blamed Hamas.
Yes, indeed. I do blame Hamas. And I do not trust them to tell us that any of the dead were terrorists. Does Barry expect that Hamas would tell us when the dead are terrorists rather than claim that they're civilians? Why then did the United Nations recently quietly revise down by nearly half the Hamas claims of civilian deaths? And yes, I do blame Hamas. They deliberately slaughtered men, women and children to start this war. They kidnapped hundreds of innocents, killed dozens of them, raped and tortured others, and still hold more than 120 hostages. So yes, I do blame Hamas. They continue to rain terror against Israel and continue to hide among Palestinian civilians who they use as human shields. I do blame Hamas because they could end the war tomorrow by releasing the hostages and laying down their arms. I blame Hamas for every death, especially every innocent civilian death in this horrible war. So yes, Paul Barry, I blame Hamas. Who do you blame? But Barry had more to say last night.
So, what was Sky After Dark discussing on Monday night? Chris Kenny and Robert Gregory from the Australian Jewish Association were focused on the rise of anti-Semitism in Australia. On our count, it's around the 30th time it's been discussed on Kenny's show since the war began.
So now the ABC approach is to ignore anti-Semitism? We've had people chanting F the Jews and gas the Jews and where's the Jews? And Barry criticises me for discussing it. We have hate preachers celebrating the slaughter of hundreds of innocents because they were Jews, and Barry criticises me for discussing that. We have university students calling for the elimination of Israel and openly pledging their support for Hamas, and Barry criticises me for discussing it. Shame on Paul Barry and the ABC. They should be investigating this anti-Semitism themselves, not turning a blind eye. And Barry, of course, accepts the views of the International Criminal Court and admonishes those of us who have criticised it.
It's a terrible thing to accuse anyone of genocide, but it's a more terrible thing that genocide should take place. In my view, Jews are only going to be safe if everyone's rights are respected, and the rights of Jews are respected along with the rights of everyone else.
It's rare to see that point of view expressed in the Australian, and you'll never hear it from Sky News commentators.
Now, there are two key points on that nonsense. The idea, the aspiration, the reality that peace can only happen long-term in the Middle East when Israel and the Israeli people are secure and are surrounded by other secure and peaceful countries and people is central to the commentary on this channel and in the Australian. So he's dead wrong again. Barry needs to learn what Hamas stands for, what it's fighting for. He needs to educate himself, actually, about whether Hamas would ever tolerate a two-state solution and whether it would ever respect the rights of the Jews. Hamas is committed to genocide, real genocide. And that's the other point. Barry backs the use of that term, genocide, against Israel. The genocide claim is obscene and absurd. To suggest a Palestinian population that has expanded more rapidly than the broader Israeli population is being subjected to genocide is to render the English language meaningless. Paul Barry, even more so than Laura Tingle, exposes the ABC's dark ideological prejudice. The fact that millions of dollars of taxpayers' money are spent every year on a program that exists only to promote his political views and mislead people according to his partisan agenda, well, that says it all about the ABC. He should be sleeping in a tent at a university campus, not paid by us to spin his green left dreams. Nobody is in charge at the ABC. They take our money under false pretences. Eventually, taxpayers will no longer indulge them.